Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sabrina, and on behalf of Choice, I'd like to welcome you to today's program, Policy and Gray Literature in Evidence Synthesis, Deepening Discoveries for Systematic and Scoping Reviews, which is sponsored by Overton. This session is one in a series of sponsored webinars from Choice that addresses new ideas and developments of interest to the academic library community. Now I'll just put a couple links in the chat where you can register for upcoming webinars and watch previous webinar recordings. Before we get started, I'd like to point out just a few features of the webinar software. All attendees who join the presentation are automatically muted and your cameras are off, so don't worry about generating any noise or feedback. We've got that taken care of for you. In the main area of the screen, you could follow along with the presentation materials. To adjust the size of the slides or video, you can use the divider in the middle of the screen to slide the sizes to your liking. We are using the Q&A feature today. Please use it to submit any questions or comments for our speakers. We'll answer as many questions as we have time for at the end of the presentation, so please type your questions into the Q&A module as they occur to you. You can also use the upvote feature to highlight questions you like or would like to be addressed. Also, there's closed captioning available for today's session. To toggle the automated captions on or off, please use the Show Captions button on the bottom panel of your screen. You could also turn on automated translation for the captions by clicking the arrow button, toggling on translation, and selecting your preferred language. Last, please note that we are recording today's program, and everyone who registered should receive a follow-up email with links to the recording and today's slides. And with that, we are ready to get started, so I will now hand it over to Ewan.
Thanks, Sabrina, and well, thanks everyone for joining us today. We're really pleased to be supporting this the webinar on policy and great literature in evidence synthesis. My name's Ewan Addy, and I'm the founder of Overton, and I'm going to cover in a few slides just to spend a couple of minutes on like what our experiences in this field as a data provider. We're a database, a kind of tool provider, but I'm really looking forward to this discussion over the next hour. Um, First of all, hopefully to cover why it's important, which many of you will already know, and also some of the kind of the practicalities and the challenges involved too. And I'm here as a tool vendor, but we've got some actual experts to talk about that as well. So our kind of how did we get here as Overton is that we've been around since 2018, and again I'll talk a bit about us in a minute, but over the past couple of years, we've really seen an awful lot of published journal articles, systematic reviews, and scoping reviews using the Overton database as a kind of a source of documents, of outputs, and LibGuides popping up recommending us for these kind of use cases. And my background's in bibliometrics, and traditionally Overton is a big policy database, was used more in kind of research assessment and finding impact case studies and where people have cited university research and policy. So it's relatively new to us. That said, a lot of my colleagues are ex-librarians, and they've been kind of tracking this and picking up on it, and then talking to the product team and saying, look, there's, I think we can actually do something really useful for people here. Let's, you know, learn from library partners and other experts and figure out what we can do next around it. So I'm very happy to be here with, like I say, some of those experts. So John Barbrick from Lancaster, and Quenby Mahood from Unity Health Toronto, and Sarah Young from Carnegie Mellon. And we're going to hear from them shortly. So I mentioned, we've been around since 2018. We're best known as this, kind of large database of policy documents, where policy is very broadly defined. And this is one of the strengths and challenges, I think, where we say, what we're interested in collecting is grey literature that was either written by policymakers or primarily for policymakers. And that means it covers, governments and government agencies, but also things like NGOs and IGOs like the World Health Organization and Food and Agricultural Organization of the UN and this kind of thing. And again, as I mentioned before, traditionally the way that data was used is because we kind of curate those documents and extract metadata, including the references from them. Universities come and for things like researcher CVs or promotion tenure packages or impact case studies or any other number of things, they want to know, we've got this list of DOIs, say, where are they appearing in this grey literature and this policy, and they're kind of they were more focused, those original use cases, on that kind of impact story. But we are also a pretty crucial discovery and literature searching tool more generally, both at undergrad level and higher up. We get used by a lot of librarians, by libraries rather, at universities and government organizations, because we do have this big index of the raw material, the government documents, and including things that I think we might cover this later, but it's a broad range, but it includes things like clinical guidelines that aren't published in journals, right? If you think about health agencies here in the UK, NICE, or the Haute Autorité de Santé in France, or AWF in Germany. There's lots of places where um, there's interesting stuff that's classed as grey literature, and that you'll miss it if you just look in the scholarly record. So because we have this large body of grey literature that's full text indexed, you can kind of help broaden the evidence base, um, and take advantage of the fact that, there's things published in the grey literature that may take a while to get to into journals and the rest of this kind of the scholarly record. And hopefully you can pick up stuff that you would otherwise miss. What we're keen on helping people with is if there's a piece of the puzzle that's in the grey literature and not in the scholarly literature, we can help you find it and then extract it in a kind of find it systematically and extract it systematically for these kind of downstream evidence synthesis and systematic review tools. So like we think we're right at the top in the kind of the data discovery part, and then you export it to other tools to do the rest of the process. I think obviously there's a lot of challenges here, which I think we'll hear about, but we have to acknowledge that the downside of having this kind of much more disparate set of documents is there's that strength in the diversity of different document types and sources, but it also means it's hard to kind of generalize about them in the same way that you can generalize to some extent about scholarly papers, for example. Um, and that's one of the things that I think everyone's still working on. There's no like well, as far as I know, there's no like widespread acknowledge this is the way that you incorporate grey literature into your different processes, and it's kind of down to institutions to experts working on their own programs to help figure that out and guide the researchers, and not least some of the people here on this talk. But what we do know is that we can do better than just kind of ad hoc searching using traditional search engines, or I guess the worst case would be something like an LLM. What we want it to be is kind of systematic and reproducible and transparent. And if we start on that basis, and then we can build up from there. That's what we're hoping to do. So just since starting this process, a few months ago, we've been, and again, on the advice of lots of different people we're talking to, we've been introducing things like more advanced search interfaces. So like the things that you might expect when doing evidence synthesis, like, Boolean searches and nearby and wildcards and field-specific searches and, searching by topics and keywords and all this kind of thing. Optimizing that exporting, again, through things like RIS to Covidence and other kind of downstream tools, rather than just focused on what we were before with the impact type of exports, and expanding the database to cover more things of interest to more countries. So we're quite a global database already, but there's always work to do to fill in the gaps, if you like. And that's an ongoing process. So always happy to talk to people, especially if you've got an interesting kind of perspective on it or project. And on that note, I think I'll stop talking and hand over to Cranby. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Ewan, and thanks everyone for being here and having me here. It's great to talk to you all. I'm an information specialist at with the knowledge synthesis team with the knowledge translation program at Unity Health Toronto. And I thought maybe just to start, I thought I'd give a little bit of a definition about gray lit and some background information, although Ewan has kindly done some of that already for us, so we can skim through this a little bit. But there are, a few definitions out there about gray literature. This is just one. So it gray literature is a field of library and information science that deals with the production, publication, distribution, and open access to multiple document types produced by governments, academics, businesses, and organizations in digital and non-digital formats, not controlled by commercial publishing. And it's that part that we often hold on to, that not controlled by commercial publishing. And we often think of it in terms of publication type. So this is just a small, short list. There's many, many other types of publications that could be considered gray literature. And you might not even agree with some of these on the list. So there's you can argue that some of these are part of the published literature and some aren't. And it is kind of a gray area, which there's that name, gray literature. Yeah, there we are. And there are known challenges, as Ewan mentioned, about gray literature. So it's often not found in bibliographic databases. That's saying there is, like we have Overton, which obviously is one source, a bibliographic database, which is great. Some conference and dissertation are found in bibliographic databases. So that's great when that happens. Oftentimes, we still have to search many other sources for this kind of literature. And that can be tricky because the search functionality might be very limited. You probably aren't going to be able to, translate your complex Medline search into some of these sources. And in some cases, you might even be doing sort of iterative searches of like a few terms over in different capacities. And that can be tricky too, to document all those different iterations and the search yields, and then also the results of those searches. So occasionally, you might be able to download those results into your reference management software program from that source, but you might not be able to. You might have to use something like a plugin from that reference management software in your web browser that allows you to capture a web page. So you have to be kind of flexible and creative about how you search and how how you're trying to document all of this. And it can be pretty time-consuming work to try and uncover this kind of evidence. And there is still a bit of serendipity involved in it. So you might be looking in one source and find that it mentions another organization or something like that, or a potential report or a project study that was being done, and then you go down that rabbit hole trying to find if like a report has been produced on that topic. So all of this to say, trying to do it in a systematic, transparent, and reproducible way as per evidence synthesis methods can be kind of tricky. So why include it? I think there can be a number of reasons. It can be evidence that's not found in the published literature for a variety of reasons that are beyond the scope. Like it's not rigorous or have methodological quality to it. It could be that there is that sort of gap between when a study is finished and the publication. So that might be part of it. It could be that the product or the research was produced for specific audiences or clients where publication is just not a priority. So we can think of like government documents, guidelines, drug reimbursement recommendations, rapid reviews, all can be great sources of evidence, but perhaps not produced or but perhaps produced for specific audiences or to answer certain questions, and maybe it won't appear in the published literature. So if we don't gather it and add it in, we would lose it. It could provide a more complete view of the evidence, so just different viewpoints. Often in the academic literature, published literature, we might see the effectiveness of an intervention, but in gray literature, we might see more around process and implementation of that evidence or intervention. So that's another aspect. It can help reduce bias. So the propensity of published literature, including just positive results rather than those that show negative results. So something else to think about. Also can provide really rich contextual information. They're not constrained to journal formats or word counts. So sometimes they can provide a lot more details that's not in a published article. And it can also be the most current available evidence, especially on topics that are brand new and moving really fast. I think we can look back at COVID and think of the preprints and government documents that were really important to look at. And when we're thinking about considering searching gray literature, I often have teams come to me and say, we're going to search here and here and here, and we're going to search the gray literature. And they just say it sort of as like it's just a thing, like, okay, I'll just go get the gray literature then. So it really is important to think about what are those document types that would be important for your topic, and study designs that will help you narrow the scope a little bit. And really think around who are the organizations, agencies, knowledge users who would be producing or utilizing that gray literature, that sort of that research. So that can help you as well guide, so you're not feeling so overwhelmed by the scope. Where to search for gray literature, there's a number of guides and tools that are really, really handy to help you sort of navigate this kind of search. So I'm just highlighting here Gray Matters, which is from Canada's Drug Agency. It's a free online tool that lists sources of health-related gray literature sources. And it has some nice categories that you can select, and then these will give you a list of references, resources to check for that kind of category. What I really like is that you can hit print and copy and add this into a Word document. There's a note field where you can add, all your information about when you searched it, what search terms you included, and what your results were. So a nice way to document a gray literature search. And then this slide, I just added several resources that I've always found helpful, and I turn to look for ideas and brainstorming and thinking around methods for gray literature. So I thought I would add those as well. And I think that's it for me. So thanks very much. I'll pass it on to Sarah.
Great. Thanks so much, Quenby. It's really nice to be here, everyone. I am Sarah Young. I'm a social sciences librarian at Carnegie Mellon University. I'm also director of our evidence synthesis program. And I do a lot of consulting work as well as an information specialist for organizations that develop evidence synthesis products for policymakers, funders, other decision makers related to social programs and policy globally. So a lot of my presentation is sort of coming from that experience as well. And I'm going to focus this short talk on kind of the unique aspects of conducting evidence synthesis in the social sciences, in part because that ties, I think, really nicely into the content that Overton provides. And I think you'll see that there's a lot of sort of additional complexity and challenges in social sciences evidence synthesis that makes sort of searching gray literature even more difficult, I would say, in some of these reviews, kind of building on what Quenby has already talked about. So first, just to set the stage, evidence synthesis is conducted across many social sciences disciplines, and it's not really new to the social sciences. In fact, Meta-analysis was first developed as a methodology in the field of education. But I would say, just from my observations, the application of evidence synthesis is increasing across these fields, everywhere from economics to political science, and even more recently in the fields of business and management. You'll also see a large range of evidence synthesis methods being used in these disciplines beyond just systematic reviews. So a couple of examples are evidence and gap maps. These are evidence products that produce sort of these large thematic matrices that show where strong evidence exists and where there are gaps in evidence. Another common method are rapid evidence assessments. These tend to prioritize speed and usability and really are meant to address practical and kind of urgent decision-making needs. I think John's also going to mention realist and integrative reviews, and these are also really important in social sciences evidence synthesis because they help sort of unpack these complex social interventions that are often studied and sort of can kind of get at the, I guess, the contextual aspects about why an intervention might work or not work in a given situation. So in addition to this range of methods, the questions themselves that are asked in these reviews can be very broad and complex. And this is in part just because of the broad and complex nature of the interventions that are studied by these reviewers. So this can really complicate the already complicated process of gray literature searching. And so, for example, the questions that are asked in these reviews can be multi-layered. So a given review might look at the effectiveness not just of one intervention, but of a set of related interventions, maybe examining a broad range of outcomes, or maybe how these interventions impact a broad range of populations. There's also a lot of conceptual and terminological variation to consider when you're designing search strategies for these reviews. So the same sort of concept or idea can be defined or talked about very differently across the various subdisciplines or maybe geographic contexts that might contribute evidence to a given review topic. A nice example of this that I often use is the concept of life satisfaction. So this is a term that's often used in the psychology literature, but it would be referred to maybe as subjective well-being or happiness in the economics literature, or maybe quality of life in the public health literature. So you really have to kind of think about these terminological variations when you're designing these what tend to be kind of complex search strategies. And also importantly, social science evidence synthesis will often draw on a wide range of evidence types. So not just quantitative, controlled studies, but also qualitative research, maybe secondary data analysis of large-scale survey data, many other types of research. And again, kind of trying to get at that kind of the contextual factors about why an intervention may or may not work. And I think gray literature, as Quenby noted, can really sort of contribute some of that contextual information to these reviews. So all of these factors, again, add a layer of complexity that makes gray literature searching even more challenging. And I think this is particularly problematic because gray literature is sometimes the primary source of evidence in these reviews. A really nice example of this on a lot of the reviews I work on are impact evaluations. These are large-scale assessments that measure the effects of a policy or program. They're often conducted by government agencies, maybe NGOs or even consultants. And these are not necessarily living in peer-reviewed literature or journals or databases. So even though these are very policy relevant and often very methodologically rigorous studies, they're not necessarily indexed in databases. And so we have to go to these organizational or agency websites to find these kinds of studies. And I think complicating this even further is the fact that these reviews are often sort of time sensitive. So these are done often sort of as commissioned research by the end users of these evidence products. So folks in government agencies, philanthropic funders, international organizations. And they're not so much interested in, what does the literature say, but their question is really, what should we fund, design, or change about our policy or program this year? So there's often an expedited timeline for these reviews, which makes it even more difficult. Quenby talked about how time-consuming gray literature searching can be. So sometimes it's just you may be left out of the process. But again, just adding some additional complexity here. So Quenby already mentioned there's a wide range of methods that we use to sort of mitigate some of these complications. And I won't go into detail here, but just a useful point to make that there really isn't one right way to do this. We're basically just making an attempt to be as comprehensive as possible, while at the same time making an effort to document our process transparently, which is challenging in gray literature. And also recognizing what resource or time constraints might exist in our project and acknowledging the limitations that might exist in our review findings due to these constraints. So just to sort of wrap up, I wanted to point out a couple of places you could go to find good examples of gray literature searching in social sciences evidence synthesis. I would say the International Initiative for Impact Evaluation, or 3IE, is a great place to see examples of this. They do very large evidence and gap maps, as well as systematic reviews, and often are searching many, many gray literature sources, and sometimes doing a very nice job of documenting that process. So I think those are really nice examples. Campbell Collaboration, which you may be familiar with, is considered sister organization to Cochrane, but they do systematic reviews, scoping reviews in many social sciences disciplines and use very good rigorous methods that often include gray literature searching. And then even the sort of What Works network organizations and clearinghouses can be a nice place also to find social sciences or policy relevant reviews that kind of tap into the gray literature. And then just to add to a couple of the nice resources that Quenby shared, these are two that I thought would be useful for social science reviews in particular. So Campbell has very recently updated their searching guidance on searching for mainly social sciences systematic reviews. It includes a couple of appendices that are useful here. One is a list of gray literature sources that can be a nice sort of starting point for pulling together that diverse set of sources that you might want to search. And then also a nice template for documenting your gray literature searching, which can be really useful. And then this paper by Godin et al. In 2015, I still think is a really nice framework for gray lit searching, kind of like walking through a process for this step of a review. And in the context, in this case, of a school feeding program review. So relevant, I would say, to sort of social sciences. And I think that's it. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it along to John.
Again. Hello. Sorry. Hello. Yes. Hello. My name's John Barbrook. I'm a faculty librarian here at Lancaster University. I'm aware you're all Americans, so that's the other Lancaster. So there is two of them, or in fact 3 or 4, I believe. I'm just going to give you a talk about what we're doing because we're integrating gray literature searching very much into our methodologies. There's a lot going on. There's a lot behind the scenes which goes on. So what I've tried to do is try to give links to our projects and QR codes. So if you are interested, please make sure to grab the presentation later and maybe follow our links. So the main thing, where did this all start? And that was when we started to really get focused on systematic reviews. Again, it's during COVID, when a lot of our research tended to move over to desk-based work, what you could do sat at home. And so the focus became quite strongly onto systematic reviews, and they very much remain embedded in teaching at Lancaster. And that's been for about 6 years. However, for 4 years, we've been using Overton to support these reviews. They've been quite a large part of supporting our systematic reviews. And that's because we support mainly scoping, realist, and integrative reviews. A lot of reviews, not the traditional systematic reviews, what works, but what works and in which situations and when and with which groups. So they're the types of reviews we're doing. Of course, this is quite a complex topic. So we do have a lot of extensive guidance and support from our library teams. We do in-person one-to-ones. We have a very popular guidance, which most of the students actually work through. And it's followed as well by academics as well. And the majority of our reviews are qualitative or mixed methods. Again, really strong and useful grey literature reviews. It's really, really important to have access to this content. And finally, and this is the bit where sometimes I get booed slightly, a lot of sole investigator and small group reviews. Our systematic reviews that we do here are actually not large group reviews you traditionally see. They can often be only one investigator, and we want them to do as good a review as possible. Are they going to do a Cochrane review? Probably not. But we'd like to think of it as good as they can get towards a Cochrane review, because at some time, maybe in 5 to 6 years, they will be producing a full group systematic review. Another thing which is very unique maybe for our thoughts around about things like reviews is the concept of decolonizing. You may have heard of decolonizing. It's very big in the UK, and it's challenging the history of the UK, the colonial system and colonialism, and the way that it's influenced academia. There's a very heavy focus on global North countries. And what we try to do is consider our practice and how do we create worldwide searches? How do we increase the access of global South academics and research to the work that we're doing? Interesting enough, a bit of history, that actually is the monument to the Rawlinson family, who are a prominent family in Lancaster. Interesting enough, they were a Quaker family. I know in the US, the Quakers, they often were known as abolitionists. They were tended to be against slavery. But in the UK, it's a little bit more complicated. They were actually a pro-slavery family, and that there was actually a monument that was defaced to their family, and that actually remains to the day. The graffiti's kept on it. So we have groups like the Lancaster Black History Group and the Quakers who discuss this very dark period in our history, very contested and difficult history, as well as internal groups like Decolonising Lancaster University. We have academics like Dr. Sunita Abraham who work with us to help us kind of integrate decolonising into our practice. So what it looks like for us is our decolonising in practice. So we actually have a decolonising literature searching guide that we're working through and developing. And this is where we consider the methodologies that we're promoting. What are we teaching our researchers? How do we reduce global North bias in our research and reviews? Often it's called citation justice. How do we increase citations of global South authors, often which are very, very focused within the grey literature? We look at equity and diversity within our search strategies, as well as maybe discouraging language filters, accessing open access databases, and unbiased screening. And all of our guidance and teaching is regularly updated with these lessons learned. We have groups which discuss this. We share our learning. And finally, the grey literature, what we're all here for today. This is the kind of the final part of the puzzle, really. How do we get all our Lancaster researchers using grey literature, actually by default, not as an added extra? How do we encourage them always to use it? We do have a lot of Global South researchers which actually undertake Global South research. Often they're being taught in Global North organizations. So one of the things we were told was very interesting is actually they need to be decolonized as well, because they're learning Global North methodologies and working within Global South topics. These can be really diverse research topics, including LGBTQ plus health and migrant population health. So again, both these research areas, they're really strong within the grey literature, and they're less represented in traditional journals. But we actually had a problem at the time. We lost a lot of our grey literature databases just when we wanted to start using them more often. So Open Grey, was no longer updated. That's the European Grey Literature Database. NHS Evidence, which was our health grey literature service, went offline. And King's Fund, they were no longer searchable for a period of about 2 years. We had a high number of first-time researchers following the systematic guidance. They'd never done a review before, so we needed to give them a bit of guidance. We noticed as well that academics, they would only search maybe one or two sources like .gov or .nhs.uk websites. And this led, obviously, they would be going on the web as well. And there were concerns, are they getting poor quality grey literature? We also attempted to index grey literature within our discovery system. This worked for a little bit until we discovered it was overwhelming. It swamped out other research resources, and it wasn't tenable for the long term. And finally, everyone kept turning up with new review methodologies. So we'd be like, oh, I'm doing this type of integrative scoping review. And we'd go, oh, great. And there was lots of really interesting research methodologies being used that we had to support. So what we did is, how do we use Overton? How are we actually integrating Overton after we brought it into the reviews? So this is very much the way that we do it. Of course, there's lots of different approaches, but we try and go as much as we can towards a systematic search. So first things first, we always go through the systematic review search. So we have them produce a highly sensitive search, work through their systematic review search with the screening. We want to make this as systematic as possible. At the time, the search interface for Overton was not as functional as we wanted. Of course, it's getting better. So we had to go and rely on the subject terms and all of the information we could get within the database to make a brilliant search. It also helps to inform us what date filters we want to use within Overton, because it can be a little bit overwhelming. Overton is always searched after the literature search, and that's something we always have to push. Always search the grey literature at the end of your search. We do actually use the document type filters to filter the guidance of policy, try and focus the search a little bit. One thing we always discourage, though, is country, region, or language filters. This is part of our Decolonised by default, and this means we don't want the limitation only to the UK. We do use regional filters, however, when looking at population groupings. The UK being a very diverse country with a lot of groups from different countries, we want to focus our research on those particular groups. So, for instance, Bangladesh, Pakistan, India. It's really good to gather that local evidence, especially within realist reviews, which are being used to tailor guidance towards a community. And this kind of methodology, it does bring in that locally applicable evidence, and I think makes a better systematic review. How do we deal with a massive amount of review of literature, which is actually provided by Overton, especially when there's only one person doing the review, remember? We recommend screening initially only 100 papers, manually ranked by relevance. That will give you enough papers to screen through, and it will focus your search. If you are a group, you can go as high as 1,000. This is my most exciting bit, is they're due to upgrade the RIS export to be adjustable, which is fantastic, because at the moment, it only allows you to export 1,000 results or none at all. And this will allow us to be a little bit more systematic with our search. The AI abstracting function, very useful for quickly reviewing for inclusion, because a lot of the grey literature is very difficult to quickly scan through. And actually, we just move on. It's one database within a package of a search strategy that we encourage the researchers to search through. So we're trying to get it as close as we can to a systematic search. And how are we doing? I just pulled 4 systematic reviews. I think we've just been mentioned that we do have quite a few which are being produced. These are the ones which just mentioned Overton in the title and abstract, but we are seeing all of them being produced all the time. We're seeing lots of researchers, and in fact, a lot of our postgrads are being encouraged by default to do an Overton or grey literature search. And just to finish with, what are our future goals with this? How do we want to use Overton? Well, one of the things we're focusing on is how do we respond to some of the missing policy within US governmental information. Lancaster, we do use this quite a lot, and we have noticed that some organizations, due to politics, have removed some of the policy documents. How do we use it to prevent the loss of that information? How are we going to integrate these new systematic improvements as well as the new risk exports and the AI abstracting within a systematic search strategy? One thing we really want to do is use grey literature, curated databases, as kind of a counter to the bias in AI. Show how much of a better search this is than just using AI. And finally, we want to have guidance. How do we transpose searches directly from Medline, PsycInfo, and other databases into Overton? So essentially, we start moving it from the grey literature side of, say, a Prisma flow diagram to the left-hand side to a fully systematic search. So thank you. That was my talk. That's how we're approaching Overton and how we're using it. And hopefully it's going to be even more tightly integrated in the future into our practice.
Great. Yeah, thanks so much, everyone. Yeah, before we move into audience Q&A, we're just going to have a brief panel discussion talking about what we learned today. So to start off, how do limitations or challenges in searching grey literature affect the completeness of evidence synthesis work? And John, maybe if we could start with you on
Okay.
this one.
I think I signed up for this one, yes. So I think it was mentioned that, yeah, without using the grey literature, you do tend to get some publication bias where in your review there will only be positive results. This effect can actually be quite prominent with more niche topics which would focus, say, on global south populations. Their research tends not to get into the general publications, into journals, and also obviously only if, for instance, it's going to be positive or it could be monetized. That's when it will make it there. The rest will end up in the grey literature. Also, with a systematic review, when the limitations of a certain review are brought up, actually, in a lot of cases, not searching grey literature is one of the top limitations of any systematic review. I consider most systematic reviews, if they're qualitative, should search the grey literature by default, even if it's just to add context to the start of a paper. So if I was to see systematic reviews without grey literature searching, I would always consider that a limitation myself. But one of the reasons it's always not been searched is because of its difficulty. Unfortunately, it's difficult to do. So if we focus on actually improving the systematic nature of grey literature searching, we're actually going to improve our search. And actually, some of the literature, I always use the NHS as an example, is they produce their systematic guidance, their NICE guidance, which is actually better quality than many systematic reviews. It's actually fantastic evidence. And we want to make sure that that's more searchable, not in the UK, but worldwide.
Great, thank you. Okay, next question. Are there risks to mitigate when utilizing grey literature as evidence, given that it isn't traditionally peer-reviewed and may lack transparent methodology? And maybe Quenby, we could start with you on this one.
Sure. I do think there's often this concern that grey literature is maybe not as rigorous or methodologically sound. And I just don't think this is always the case. There's problems with peer review. We've all seen those studies where we're kind of like, how did this get published when you actually read through the methods? So that's one piece, but also, if we do think about health technology assessments, rapid reviews, even dissertations, many of these may have had levels of peer review embedded like internally, and they may even be as rigorous or more so than some of the traditional published literature that we think of. And they might even be more transparent about their methods because they might have more space. They're not confined to a word count, say, or a specific format. They might be able to be more transparent about what they've been doing. So I always worry when people make it sound like, oh, the grey literature is poor quality, say, or something like that, and not to be included as, and it also can still be we can still apply criteria, quality and critically appraise this research as well. So those are just aspects to think about. And I think too, if it's the research isn't clear in certain aspects, then we do this with the published literature as well. You reach out if you're unsure, then you can reach out to authors for more information.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that, I think just this week there was a new paper that came out in Research Synthesis Methods about barriers to searching gray literature, where they surveyed reviewers and journal editors, and concerningly found that a large percentage of journal editors actually still think that gray literature should not be included in reviews. So I think there's a lot of barriers to overcome in terms of people's understanding of why it's so important to include gray literature. Especially given that, yeah, there's sort of this gatekeeping going on at the journal editor level. But I can put a link to that study in the chat. I think it's a good one to look at.
Oh, if I could finally interject as well, I agree absolutely. And one of the things we've been battling a little bit about is the concept of you should always copy a previously produced systematic review search. And actually, when you consider the quality of the searches, and a lot of systematic reviews aren't very good, unfortunately. So we've been encouraging a lot of our researchers just to produce their own searches, follow using guidance, because things change so quickly and they get so better. So if you follow the old one, it says not to search grey literature. Their decision was just because of the difficulty in searching, not because it wasn't needed.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Okay, next question. How can incorporating gray literature change or enrich the findings of an evidence synthesis? And maybe Sarah, start with you.
Sure. I mean, I think a lot of people have already made, points as to why adding gray literature is important to, reduce bias and add sort of some of that contextual knowledge to the review findings. I think Quenby already alluded to this, but there are limitations to what peer-reviewed literature can provide in terms of these sort of hard word limits that mean that researchers tend to maybe even cherry pick some of the findings from their research study, where they might only be reporting the results of some of the outcomes that were measured. For example, this is something that is referred to as reporting bias when you're talking about risk of bias. And when you're sort of looking at the quality of evidence. So again, you might have a much more complete picture of what the findings were from a given study from a dissertation or, lengthy government or research report. So yeah, I think just kind of adding to a lot of what folks have already mentioned, but lots of good reasons to include gray lit.
I could add to just that to remember that not everybody has this publish or perish aspect. One of the first reviews I was on was about ergonomics, and we had an ergonomist, hard to say, on the team and also as our knowledge users, and they didn't have that incentive to publish. It was more important for them to go and present their findings at conferences and to create reports for organizations. And so gray literature, if we had not included it in that review, would have missed I think, as Sarah said, a huge portion of the evidence for that topic. And so we focused on those particular gray lit types specifically for that review.
So, okay, great. Thanks, everyone. I think a lot of good questions here, so I might move on to the audience Q&A. So it looks like our top question is from Peter. What are the best practices of distinguishing between gray literature searching methods that are appropriate for a librarian and methods that are more appropriate for a subject specialist or a project's PI? I'll just open that up. Anyone who wants to jump in.
I don't know. Oh, I might come. This is a bit of an opinion, but or sorry, Sabina. I um, but I think there should be no difference between the methods used by a librarian and a subject specialist or PI. They should be essentially the same methodologies, if possible, because one of the best ways of improving a systematic review is the involvement of a librarian within that review. So we don't, unless we want to have a massive team of librarians in our university, we don't have the time to support everyone. So what we need to do is have methodologies to teach the kind of the things that we're introducing into the reviews to those reviewers. And that's what we try and do. We try and encourage them to act a bit more like a librarian and actually have these in-depth search strategies. So in our case, wouldn't be any different at all, hopefully.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I don't know if Peter was alluding to this, but sometimes when you're searching certain sources, you can't download the results. There's no easy way to export search results, which means the only way to go about it is you do a search and then you sort of screen kind of on the fly, pull out things that appear relevant. And that's something I do tend to leave to the domain experts. So my sort of approach is typically to recommend search approaches for a given website, for example, maybe what search terms to try, how to structure the search, recognizing what, maybe that stemming doesn't work on a given website. So, that's not something maybe a non-expert searcher would even think about. Or maybe stemming does work on a website. So those are things I would test, make recommendations, and then have the researchers run those searches so they can sort of decide what's relevant from the results. But yeah, it often I feel like the gray literature is kind of more of a collaborative part of that searching step.
Thanks, everyone. Okay. Another question, another popular question also from Peter. Are there developing or released best practices for utilizing and reporting generative AI tools as one method to identify relevant gray literature? If anyone wants to start.
Can I say I don't know of any just yet, but I do know of a lot of work being done on human-in-the-loop methodologies within searching the grey literature. So basically using AI as a supplementary layer in the platforms for improving discoverability of grey literature, which again, as giving a bit of a sales pitch for Overton, the fact that you're using the abstracting, you're producing enhanced abstracts using AI, and then using that to improve the discoverability. That's sort of not kind of released best practice, but that's maybe where the best practice will be going, moving away from just that automatic discoverability, the magic box using AI, but into the human deciding what they want to see, but then having the AI enhance things to allow them to get over those barriers that prevent you using grey literature.
Great.
Yeah, I'm not sure that it's specific to gray literature, but Cochrane has the responsible use of AI raise, I think is I can find the link for it, for responsible use of AI in evidence synthesis, which might be helpful. But yeah, I don't know of any off the top of my head at this point. It's still emerging.
Yeah, same. I would lean on the Ray's recommendations, which is kind of broadly about the use of AI and generative AI in evidence synthesis.
Got it. Thanks, everyone. Okay, this question might be for Ewan. Ewan, having an index of gray literature that is up to date is great, but if the content isn't rehosted and preserved outside of its original location, it might fade from gray to invisible. Does Overton preserve the content that it indexes, or does it only include gray literature in the index that is securely hosted somewhere else?
We do keep a copy. So really the question here is more about like, can we distribute the copy to other people? And it's completely dependent on the copyright of where we collected it from. So and it changes. So in the UK, for example, you have an open government license. If we have a copy of that and the original link goes down, we can distribute it as long as that license is attached. That's fine. But in the US, there's lots of weird things around. Again, there's lots of open licenses, but there's also licenses where, for example, you can redistribute it within the continental US, but not outside. So the actual copyright license is different for Americans and non-Americans, and lots of things like that. So it's actually quite difficult to keep track of. So we do keep a copy. It's how easy is it to make it available once that link goes down that's the tricky bit. And I think us and lots of other platform providers are still working on that.
Definitely. Okay, we've a question that's kind of relevant or related to that. How is the ongoing censorship or outright removal of guidances available from US government sources impacting gray literature searching strategies, especially when compared to diverging guidances from non-US government entities?
I can say something not about the guidance, but about it's interesting because we've heard about it more now in the US with the EPA, and I think from a data provider and tools perspective, the problem has actually been to find out when it's happening. When something's removed, we can see it's been removed. That's not so much the problem. The problems are the ones where it's the same document, it's the same website, the same address, but a section has been extract like removed from it. And so the full text that we have, for example, is not now the full text in the original source, and that's something we obviously want to avoid. Um, but that said, like that's a kind of a negative example of it. We have the same kind of problems with positive things, where sometimes there's like a living, almost like a living review type document somewhere, and people are adding to it all the time. But again, it's in the same place, and it's not clear from the metadata. It's like the publication date is still the date that it was first produced, and they're not kind of updating that. So it is a problem, but it's not just something. It's a US government thing. It's more broadly about just keeping in sync and tracking changes, I think.
Or we do have like, well, it's internal and it's just being externally. We do have an approach which is taking into consideration that a systematic review methodology. We're encouraging searching more grey literature searches, some of which are indexing resources on their platforms. So therefore, we're hopefully, just like a systematic review search would search multiple databases and fill in the gaps for missing evidence. By doing this search and searching multiple grey literature databases, in fact, we're going to reduce the risk of missing data because some are indexing that information. There's lots of sources which are going in and actually looking at the US government data and actually just mirroring it essentially. So they're going to become a greater part of our strategies in order to mitigate against the loss.
Yeah, I was just going to say, thinking about something like the Internet Archive or looking at, you might be familiar with the Data Rescue Project that's trying to preserve as much government data as it can. Those might be places that are collecting documents that could, end up disappearing. So those, yeah, incorporating that into kind of the searching would be a good idea.
Thanks, everyone. I think we have time for one more if we're quick. There's two questions around like searching globally. So I will kind of combine them. Would you comment on searching for gray literature internationally and in other languages, Spanish, for example? Any general lessons or experiences with that? Searching in your country versus globally?
I can and so John mentioned AI, like generative AI being used to create abstracts and things before. So I think there's this balance here. So our approach is the original document is obviously, especially with policy documents, there's no lingua franca. It's not like academia where you can say a lot of documents are in English. So Spanish and Arabic and Chinese and German and French and everything. And to be complete, what you really need to do is search in all those original your terms for all those original languages. And if you're not a native speaker, you're going to miss things. So there's that kind of the gold standard on one edge. Our approach in the end is to do this using AI because it wouldn't be possible otherwise to create kind of like an abstract in English for every paper. So the downside is obviously the keywords are now, you know, not the original ones in the document. It's been extracted by Gen AI, but it is in English. So that's the other extreme where you can search in English and still get back matches in other languages. But obviously, there's more then of a burden for you to do the screening and the checking.
Okay, great. I think we're at the end of the hour here, so we will wrap up here. Thanks so much to Ewan, Quenby, Sarah, and John for taking the time to speak with us today, and thank you to our attendees for your questions and comments. I'd like to remind our viewers that we did record today's program, so be on the lookout for a follow-up email from Choice with links to the recording and today's slides. Also, if you have a few minutes after the presentation to fill out a brief survey, we would really appreciate it. So thanks again to all of you out there for joining us. We hope you learned something new from the webinar and hope to see you again soon on another session. Thanks, everyone.